Comrades, how long will you allow the engines of profit to define the limits of your existence? How long will you measure your worth by the wages that barely sustain you, while the wealth your hands create is siphoned upward like blood rushing to a parasite? This is not merely a question, it is an indictment. An indictment of a system that teaches you to doubt your strength, to accept domination as destiny, and to confuse survival with freedom. Today, we tear away the veil. Today, we expose the mechanism of your oppression. Today, we confront the truth that your worth is not measured by the market, but by the immense creative power that lives within you. The greatest triumph of the ruling order is not merely the extraction of labor, nor the accumulation of wealth wrested from the hands that produce it. Its greatest triumph is ideological. The ability to convince the very people who create the world that they are worth less than the commodities they bring into existence. This illusion of worth, imposed from above, is the quiet machinery that keeps exploitation running even when no whip is raised, even when no overseer stands in sight. It is the unseen chain that binds the worker to the system more tightly than any iron shackle. From the moment an individual is thrust into the realm of production, a narrative begins to shape their perception. They are taught to believe that their value lies not in their humanity, not in their creative capacity, but in what the market is willing to pay for their time. The market, an abstraction upheld as sacred, becomes the arbiter of worth. If wages are low, it is assumed the worker's contribution is meager. If wages stagnate, it is assumed their skill has reached its natural limit. Thus, people internalize a lie disguised as economic law, that worth is equivalent to wage. But this is not law, it is design. The system requires this illusion because without it, the structure of power collapses. If the worker were to recognize that the wealth accumulated by the owners is nothing but the crystallized product of their own exertion, their obedience would be shattered. Therefore, everything is arranged to ensure they never arrive at this realization. It is not enough for capital to rely on physical labor, it must also colonize consciousness. It must ensure that individuals do not see themselves as producers of value, but as recipients of opportunity. It must make the exploited grateful for their exploitation. The illusion functions through several mechanisms. First, the wage form itself conceals the true relationship of power. Workers receive payment at the end of the day, and this payment appears as though it is a fair exchange for the labor they have given. Yet this payment represents only a fraction of the value they have produced. The rest is quietly siphoned upward. The illusion is effective because it makes exploitation appear as compensation. The worker sees the wage, not the value they generate beyond it. Second, competition among workers strengthens the lie. When individuals are pitted against one another for employment, promotions, or survival, they begin to view each other as rivals rather than allies. This fragmentation reinforces the idea that worth must be proven, defended, or increased through individual struggle. The worker becomes preoccupied with outperforming others, rather than questioning why the fruits of collective labor are monopolized by a small minority. In this way, the system prevents unity, not by force, but by fostering insecurity. Third, capital masks its dependence on labor by glorifying the owners as innovators, visionaries, and indispensable leaders. The narrative suggests that without the capitalist, nothing would be produced, that factories would remain empty shells, machines silent, and workplaces purposeless. This inversion of reality hides the obvious truth. Without the worker, capital is nothing but dead matter, incapable of motion or creation. The system elevates the owners to a godlike status while reducing the worker to an expendable tool. Thus, people come to believe that their worth is derived from serving those above them rather than from the labor they perform. This ideological construction is not accidental, it is essential. For capital to thrive, the worker must underestimate themselves. They must believe that their condition is natural, unavoidable, even necessary. They must accept the idea that suffering through long hours, meager wages, and perpetual uncertainty is the price of existence. They must internalize the belief that the system is immutable and that any attempt to change it is unrealistic. In this way, the illusion becomes self-perpetuating. Once the worker accepts their supposed inferiority, the chains need no further tightening. But all illusions, no matter how powerful, are fragile when confronted with truth. The moment the worker recognizes that they are the source of all value, the illusion cracks. When they see that the wealth of society rises not from the brilliance of the owners but from the labor of millions, their dignity resurfaces. When they understand that their low wage is not a reflection of low worth, but a reflection of systemic theft, the ideological foundation of exploitation begins to crumble. And when they recognize that unity among workers extinguishes insecurity and fear, the power of the ruling class is shaken at its core. Thus, the illusion of worth imposed by capital is not merely a deception, it is a battleground, and the first step toward liberation is the radical act of seeing through it. The ruling order maintains its dominance not only through ownership of factories, machines, and land, but through ownership of perception. Its greatest fear is not the strike, the protest, or the uprising. It is the moment an ordinary worker awakens to the truth of their own power. For once such awareness emerges, submission begins to erode, and with it the entire architecture of exploitation. The worker who recognizes their true worth becomes a threat not because they wield weapons or revolt immediately, but because their consciousness has slipped beyond control. They become dangerous simply by seeing clearly. The system depends on a fog. It depends on individuals believing they are small, limited, replaceable. It depends on people feeling that their contributions are marginal, that their labor is a favor granted by those who give them work. Every institution, every ideology, every mechanism of the ruling class aims to maintain this fog. The moment it lifts, the moment workers perceive themselves not as appendages of capital, but as the engines of all production, the balance of power shifts irreversibly. Why does awareness pose such a threat? Because the worker who realizes their worth no longer sees the world as the owners intend. They no longer accept exploitation as inevitable. They no longer internalize the lie that they exist merely to serve the profit of another. They begin to understand that the wealth of society is not gifted from above, but created below through calloused hands, sleepless nights, disciplined minds, and unwavering effort. They understand that factories, offices, railways, fields, and digital networks all depend upon one source, labor. And once this truth becomes undeniable, everything else changes with it. Awareness transforms the worker's relationship to labor itself. No longer do they view their time as something to be sold cheaply, nor their skills as something to be apologized for. Instead, they see their labor for what it truly is, the substance that animates the world. The machines do not come alive without them. The systems do not run without them. The so-called visionaries, executives, and owners possess nothing but titles, unless the worker brings their commands into reality. Once this is understood, the worker begins to question why those who contribute least claim the greatest share of society's wealth. A dangerous shift occurs. The worker recognizes that dependence does not run downward, but upward. It is not the worker who relies on the owner, it is the owner who relies on the worker. This realization is the spark that has ignited every great upheaval throughout history. It is not the material condition alone that drives transformation, it is the recognition that one's power has been suppressed. When the worker understands that they are the majority, and more importantly, the indispensable majority, their posture changes. Fear begins to dissipate. Isolation gives way to solidarity. Confidence grows where resignation once lived. The ruling class fears this transformation of consciousness more than any economic crisis. A crisis can be managed, consciousness cannot be easily reversed. Once awakened, the worker begins to see exploitation not as a natural order, but as an intolerable theft. They begin to ask questions that threaten the very foundation of the system. Why does the one who labors live in scarcity while the one who owns lives in abundance? Why should the many endure suffering so the few may accumulate luxury? Why must productivity rise endlessly while wages stagnate? Why must life itself be dictated by the rhythm of profit? These questions, once awakened, spread quickly. They move from one worker to another, from one shop floor to another, from one neighborhood to another. Awareness becomes contagion. And with each mind it touches, the ruling class loses another fragment of its ideological grip. But the worker who knows their worth does not only gain clarity, they gain purpose. They understand that liberation does not come through individual struggle, but through collective power. They recognize that unity is not merely desirable, but essential. The dangerous worker becomes a dangerous class when this awareness deepens, when solidarity is forged from shared suffering and shared potential. At this point, power begins to tilt. The worker realizes they are not merely participating in society, they are capable of transforming it. They become dangerous because they no longer fear those who exploit them. They become dangerous because they begin to see themselves not as victims, but as agents of history. They become dangerous because they understand that every system built on their oppression is fragile, and that the world can be remade by their hands. The ruling class trembles not at the worker who toils, but at the worker who thinks. Not at the worker who obeys, but at the worker who questions. Not at the worker who suffers, but at the worker who awakens. For the moment a worker realizes their true worth, the world they inhabit, the world that exploits them, diminishes them, and depends on their blindness, is one step closer to collapse. The structure of the present order is built upon chains not always visible, not always acknowledged, but always felt by those whose labor sustains it. These chains are not forged from metal, but from necessity, dependency, and the silent coercion of economic power. They bind the worker not through open force, but through the subtle compulsion of survival. To understand the nature of these chains is to understand why liberation is not simply desirable, but imperative. The worker enters the realm of production already tethered. They have no ownership of the means by which life is sustained, no claim over the tools, land, or machinery that determine the rhythm of society. They possess only their ability to labor, and even this must be sold in order to live. This condition-compelled labor under the control of another is the essence of the chain. It is the root of exploitation. For when a person's only means of survival is to offer their time, strength, and creativity to those who own the means of production, they are not free, they are bound. These chains tighten through the economic arrangement itself. The worker receives a wage, but the wage is carefully calculated to secure just enough for subsistence, never enough for autonomy. The worker is kept in perpetual motion, work today to afford tomorrow. Any pause threatens ruin. Thus, the chain loops around their existence, forcing them into continuous labor for another's enrichment. The owners understand this dynamic well. They do not need to whip the worker into obedience. The fear of starvation, homelessness, or deprivation performs that role far more effectively. But the chains of capital do not merely bind the body, they bind the mind. Every institution under its sway teaches that such a system is natural, inevitable, eternal. Schools praise the owners as visionaries. Media glorifies wealth as the product of genius rather than exploitation. Religion sanctifies suffering as a virtue, and politics frames inequality as a matter of individual merit rather than systemic design. In this way, the chains become internalized. People come to believe that their place in society is fixed, that resistance is futile, that their condition is the result of personal failure rather than structural theft. The system survives because these chains are mistaken for the normal order of life. Yet oppression creates its own contradiction. As the chains tighten, as exploitation deepens, as wealth concentrates into the hands of the few, the worker begins to perceive the reality obscured from them. They notice that the harder they labor, the richer others become. They observe that increased productivity brings no improvement to their own condition. They see that economic growth benefits only those at the top, while the majority remain trapped in the same cycle of toil. These experiences reveal the true nature of the system. It is not designed to elevate the many, but to empower the few. And once this recognition emerges, the demand for liberation follows naturally. Liberation cannot be granted by those who profit from chains. It must arise from those who bear them. It begins with the realization that the worker is the source of all social wealth, and that the owners merely appropriate what others produce. It deepens with the understanding that no ruling class in history has surrendered its privileges voluntarily, and it matures with the recognition that unity, not individual struggle, is the weapon of the oppressed. The chains of capital can be shattered only through collective power. The worker isolated is weak, but the worker united is formidable. The ruling class depends on fragmentation, competition, and division among those they exploit. They fear the moment when workers see their common conditions, their shared exploitation, their collective strength. For unity transforms the countless isolated chains into one great force capable of breaking them all. Liberation demands not only resistance but transformation. It requires the creation of a society in which the means of production are owned and controlled by those who labor, not those who exploit. It demands the abolition of a system where human beings are reduced to instruments of profit. It calls for a world where work is not coerced, where value is not stolen, where dignity is not contingent on wages, and where life is not dictated by the pursuit of surplus. The chains of capital are heavy, but they are not unbreakable. They persist only because workers believe they must bear them. The moment they stand together, the moment they refuse to submit, the chains begin to crack. And when the oppressed recognize not only their suffering but their power, liberation becomes not only possible, it becomes inevitable. For no system built on domination can survive the awakening of those who sustain it. The forces that dominate the present order do not rely solely on economic power. They rely on the disunity of those they exploit. The isolated worker is manageable, predictable, and easily subdued. But when workers recognize one another as comrades in a shared struggle, when they move from isolated individuals into an organized collective, the foundation of the system trembles. Thus, the most urgent task before the oppressed is not merely to understand their condition, but to rise, organize, and transform the world that has been built on their backs. Every historical transformation has begun not with the rulers, but with the ruled. Empires have crumbled, regimes have collapsed, and oppressive structures have dissolved not because the powerful willed it, but because ordinary people refused to continue carrying burdens that served others more than themselves. The same truth confronts the world today. The system depends entirely on the compliance of those who labor, and the moment they withdraw their obedience, the machinery of exploitation grinds to a halt. To rise, however, requires more than anger, it requires consciousness. It demands that workers see through the illusions designed to fragment and pacify them. The illusion that exploitation is natural. The illusion that competition among workers is inevitable. The illusion that power rests in boardrooms, parliaments, or executive offices, rather than in the collective strength of those who labor. The ruling class thrives on these distortions, for only a divided working class can be controlled. But once these illusions dissolve, the oppressed begin to perceive the enormous power hidden within their unity. Organization is not a secondary task, it is the weapon that transforms awakening into action. The worker who understands exploitation but remains isolated can do little to alter their condition. They may resist, but their resistance is limited to individual struggle, easily ignored or crushed. But when organization brings together thousands who share the same exploitation, the same wounds, the same indignities, their individual grievances merge into a common struggle, their voices merge into one. Their strength multiplies beyond any calculation. The ruling class understands this more clearly than the workers often do. It is why they invest heavily in dividing lines, lines of nationality, religion, language, race, skill, gender, and status. They use these lines to prevent workers from seeing their common interests, to ensure that unity remains elusive. They promote competition between workers for wages, promotions, and survival itself. They encourage mistrust and suspicion so that the exploited remain preoccupied with one another rather than with the system that exploits them. These divisions are not natural, they are engineered. To rise is to reject these artificial barriers. It is to recognize that the worker in the factory and the worker in the office face the same theft of labor. It is to understand that the migrant laborer and the native-born laborer suffer under the same economic coercion. It is to see that no matter how different their circumstances may appear, their ultimate interests align against a structure that enriches itself by pitting them against each other. Organization must therefore be rooted in solidarity, not a sentimental solidarity, but a strategic one grounded in shared exploitation. When workers bring their struggles together, when they coordinate their demands, their actions, and their goals, they create a force more potent than any weapon the ruling class possesses. Time itself becomes their ally. The daily functioning of society becomes their battleground. The system that once seemed unassailable begins to reveal its fragility. But rising and organizing are not ends in themselves. They are the path toward transformation. To transform society means to remake its very foundations. It means challenging the ownership of the means of production, the distribution of wealth, the structure of power, and the ideology that justifies exploitation. It means replacing a system built on profit with a system built on human dignity. Such transformation cannot occur through reforms that leave the core of exploitation intact. It requires a fundamental reordering of social relations, one in which the producers of wealth collectively control the conditions of their labor. Transformation is not a dream, it is a necessity. For a society that relies on exploitation cannot provide real freedom, real equality, or real development for the majority. It can only perpetuate cycles of poverty, alienation, and domination. The workers must therefore rise not merely to resist, but to reclaim their power, to reclaim their dignity, to reclaim the world they create with their labor. The call is clear: rise from resignation, organize beyond division, and transform the structure that has long suppressed the potential of millions. When workers discover their unity, they cease to be subjects and become the architects of a new world. In that moment, the chains of exploitation weaken, and the possibility of liberation becomes not a distant dream, but an imminent reality. For history belongs not to those who dominate, but to those who dare to rise together. The greatest violence inflicted upon the worker is not merely the extraction of labor, nor even the appropriation of the wealth that labor produces. The deepest wound lies in the calculated degradation of human worth. A system built on exploitation must first convince the exploited that they deserve no better, that their abilities, their creativity, their strength, and their intelligence are limited to what the market is willing to pay for them. This deliberate narrowing of human potential is not accidental, it is essential to maintaining the existing order. From birth, individuals are conditioned to measure themselves through the standards of an economic structure that cares nothing for their humanity. Productivity, efficiency, obedience, these become the metrics of value. The worker is told their worth is determined by their output, by how closely they can resemble the machine to which they are tethered. Every institution reinforces this illusion. Schools prepare children for labor rather than liberation. Workplaces judge people not by their character but by the surplus they generate. Society praises wealth as virtue and poverty as failure. In this environment, one's worth becomes a commodity, something to be evaluated, bought, and sold. But this imposed measure of worth is a lie designed to ensure that people never glimpse the vast potential that lies beyond their economic role. The system cannot function if workers understand their true power. It depends on ensuring that they remain small in their own eyes. To accomplish this, it imposes a narrative of inferiority, that the owners are the creators, the thinkers, the indispensable forces of society, while the workers are the passive recipients of opportunity. This inversion of reality is one of the most insidious forms of domination. It disguises exploitation as generosity and dependence as privilege. It convinces the worker that without the owner, nothing would function, when in truth, without the worker, everything would collapse instantly. The worker creates the world, yet the system teaches them to feel insignificant within it. Every building that rises, every road that extends across the horizon, every device that sustains modern life, every system that organizes society, all of it emerges from labor. And yet the worker, the very source of value, is denied recognition, denied dignity, denied the ability to claim the wealth they produce. Instead, they are told to be grateful for wages that barely sustain them. They are told their dreams must be realistic, their ambitions practical, their demands excessive. These restrictions are not reflections of reality, they are chains forged through ideology. And yet, the truth persists beneath the surface. The worker possesses immense creative power. The mind that plans and designs, the hands that craft and build, the perseverance that transforms raw material into usable goods, these are the forces that make society possible. The value of human labor is immeasurable because it is the origin of everything that exists in the economic sphere. When workers begin to recognize this truth, cracks appear in the facade of inevitability that the system constructs. If their worth is greater than their wage, then the wage itself is exposed as theft. If their value exceeds what the system acknowledges, then the system is revealed as fraudulent. And if their potential extends beyond what they have been taught to accept, then the world they inhabit becomes no longer a fixed reality, but a structure that can be changed. This realization is dangerous to the ruling order, for it awakens the understanding that human worth cannot be contained by economic categories. It reveals that people are not instruments of production, but beings capable of shaping history. It exposes the truth that the system does not elevate human potential, it suppresses it. It confines creativity, stifles thought, and narrows the horizon of possibility to maintain control. But once the worker recognizes that they are worth infinitely more than the system allows, a profound transformation begins. They stop measuring themselves against the narrow demands of capital. They begin to see their intelligence, strength, and creativity as forces that can shape society rather than merely serve it. They understand that their value does not rise and fall with the fluctuations of the market. They recognize that their worth is intrinsic, rooted in their capacity to create, to reason, to cooperate, and to imagine. With this realization comes confidence. With confidence, courage. With courage, unity. And with unity, the possibility of revolution. The worker who knows their worth cannot be pacified with small concessions. They cannot be manipulated with false promises or subdued with threats. They become aware that the world they labor to build could belong to them, that the wealth they produce could sustain them, that the freedom they seek is not an abstract ideal but a material possibility. You are worth more than the system allows you to believe. You always have been. And the moment you fully grasp this truth, the foundations of exploitation begin to crumble, because a person who knows their worth cannot remain a slave to any system. Comrades, we have walked through the corridors of exploitation, illuminated the illusions that bind you, and exposed the machinery that turns your labor into wealth for others. We have revealed how the system diminishes your worth, obscures your power, and chains you through necessity, ideology, and fear. But in every shadow of oppression, there remains a spark, your awakening. And now the truth stands before you with unmistakable clarity. You are the creators of value. You are the engines of society. You are the force that moves history. The structures that dominate your life depend entirely on your labor, your obedience, your blindness. The moment you recognize your true worth, the moment you see through the illusions imposed upon you, the moment you stand beside your fellow workers, not as competitors, but as comrades, that is the moment the world begins to change. The chains of capital are powerful, but they are fragile before the united will of those who sustain the entire system. For what is a factory without its workers? What is a corporation without its staff? What is society without the millions whose hands and minds breathe life into it? Nothing. Absolutely nothing. And this is why your awakening is feared. Once you understand that your worth extends far beyond the narrow confines of wages and titles, you become impossible to contain. You begin to imagine a world in which dignity is not purchased, in which labor is not stolen, in which the wealth you create belongs to the many instead of the few. You begin to see liberation not as a distant hope, but as an urgent necessity. But understanding alone is not enough. You must rise. You must organize. You must transform. Rise from the resignation that has been drilled into you. Organize with those who share your struggle. For unity is the weapon the ruling class fears most. Transform the system that has long fed upon your labor, your time, your dreams. The future does not belong to the powerful, it belongs to those who dare to shape it. And you, the workers, the creators, the exploited, the forgotten, have within you a strength greater than any oppressor has ever wielded. The strength of millions who share the same chains, the same suffering, and the same destiny. Break the illusions, break the silence, break the chains. For when you finally claim your worth, not the worth assigned to you by the market, nor the worth permitted by those in power, but your true worth as the architects of society, you become unstoppable. The world you dream of is not impossible. It is waiting, and it will be built by your hands.